through my words, O God, and in our hearts. Show us our blindness. Amen. Please be seated. I did warn you last week that this gospel was even longer than the last one, so I hope everybody got their stretches in this morning. But I actually love this story because it's really funny. It's just silly the way this poor, formerly blind man, who for one thing doesn't get a name, which seems rather cruel, because he's not even the blind guy, he's now the was blind guy. He gets just bounced around because these Pharisees don't know what to do with him. They keep on trying to fit this square peg into a round hole of trying to understand how is it that this guy was made to see by somebody who did work on the Sabbath. And if he was made to see, then that was God's involvement. But if someone did it to work on the Sabbath, then God wasn't involved. But he can see, maybe it wasn't him to start with. Maybe this is just some kind of elaborate hoax. And I love when they ask him, well, who was it that opened your eyes? And he says, I don't know, I didn't see him. Yeah, I don't know if you knew this about me, but up until recently, I couldn't see very well. Because it's this delayed healing, right? It's not Jesus sort of doing the laying on of hands. It's like, all right, here's your mud and go and wash it off, which now we pay hundreds of dollars for. So, so he comes back seeing, and he just has this experience. But they don't know what to do with him, right? They're talking to his parents. They're talking to other people around them. They're asking him, what's going on? How did this happen? And finally, he's just fed up with it. He's like, look, you ask me over and over again, who did this? How did it happen? I've told you and I've told you. What more do you possibly want from me? And the strange thing, of course, is that as this man who was born blind goes through this process of being questioned and berated and kicked out, he comes to a deeper and deeper understanding of who Jesus is. Because remember, he starts by saying, the man called Jesus. He made mud, he put it in my eyes, I washed it, now I see. That's all I know. He probably thought at that point that was going to be the end of the questioning, and they would take their theological questions elsewhere. But they can't leave it alone. And so they ask him, well, what do you say about him? And he gives probably the safest answer, which is, well, he must be a prophet, right? I mean, blind seeing, like, that's a big deal. So I've got to assume something else is going on. And finally, he acknowledges to them that, he must have been sent from God. How can you not see this? He is standing there. He says, look, here's this astonishing thing. You say he's a sinner, but he opened my eyes. And God doesn't listen to sinners. So how is this guy not from God? Nobody's ever done this before. And finally, when he meets Jesus, when he sees him for the first time, he calls him Lord, and he worships. He goes from being literally blind and spiritually blind to having his eyes opened physically and spiritually, to understanding the truth of what is going on here, understanding the truth of who Jesus is and what that means for him. Now, the thing about John is that he has his own blindness. John's gospel has these tensions in it. And this is the time of year as we build up to the story of the Passion when we are increasingly aware of them. It may have just rushed right by you in sort of all the torrent of words we just heard. But did you notice how these leaders, they start out as being Pharisees, and then at some point along the line, they're just referred to as the Jews. And that's a problem. It's been a problem for the church. It's certainly been a problem for the Jewish community. And it's a problem for John. A lot of scholars understand that John was writing around the end of the first century, so about 60, 70 years after the resurrection. And at this point, John's community, John's Christian community, they had all been faithful Jews, just like Jesus. And they understood Jesus to be a Jewish Messiah, and so they understood their movement to be one within Judaism. But as time goes on, as more and more Gentiles are welcomed into the nascent church, you have this split, where essentially what happens is the Christians, those who follow Jesus, are removed, kicked out from the synagogues. And that phrase, to be kind of kicked out of the synagogue, Greek is funny, they can just kind of slap words together, so it's literally just anybody who confesses Jesus to be the Messiah is going to be out-synagogued, like just de-synagogued, I guess. They're going to be kicked out. And that's not a word that people really used, at least not until John's time. So this is John looking back on his own complicated relationship with his Jewish siblings and putting that onto this story of Jesus, where he can't seem to acknowledge that it was not all of the Jews, but rather one portion, the Pharisees, the leaders, the ones who had the most to lose from what Jesus had to say. It's this blind spot for him, and he can never quite get over his own anger at his former community. He can never quite get over his own sadness about that. And so we have these lines where it seems as though John is blaming all of the Jews of all times for what happened to Jesus. And if we're honest, that's a strain, a blind spot that exists throughout Christian history. We have this narrative that so often goes unspoken, is often denied, but then kind of sticks around, that the Jewish people, at least of Jesus' day, if not of today as well, are somehow responsible for Jesus' death. Or at the very least, that they were failures, uniquely sinful for not listening to the gospel message as Jesus proclaimed it. It's important that we understand that that is wrong. It's important that we understand that to blame Jews either of the time or certainly today as a whole for Jesus' death is to deny Jesus' own Jewishness, is to deny our own roots within Judaism, and is certainly to deny the image of God in our Jewish siblings today. It's a blind spot in the gospel. It's a blind spot in John's story. It's a blind spot in the history of the church. But strangely enough, the good news of this story, the good news that we just heard, is that we are blind. The good news here is that we do not have all of the answers. The good news is that we do not see the ways in which God is moving and working in the world today. And that is good news because as soon as we assume that we have it all right, as soon as we decide that our sight is completely restored, our eyes are wide open, and we've got it all, as soon as we do that, we have made God in our own image. We have turned God from someone who can lead us to someone who can simply cheerlead for us and our pet causes. So the good news is that we are blind. The good news is that you and I have blind spots that we don't even know that we have. We have all of the ways in which we allow our unexamined biases, our assumptions about the world to cloud our judgment, to keep us from seeing the image and love and life of God in those around us. We are blind. And that is good news because only when we acknowledge that, only when we can say earnestly that there are things we do not understand, there are ways that God is moving in the world that is beyond what we have come to know, only then can we begin to have our eyes opened a bit at a time. Only then can we find the healing that we need. There's a preacher named William Sloane Coffin who was active in the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s. And he is credited with having shared several times that it is common to say that the church is a crutch. And to that he said, well, of course it is. You saying you don't limp? Of course we need Jesus. Of course we need someone to open our eyes. You saying you can see? You're saying you've got it all right? No, we don't. We miss things. We have our own blind spots. We have moments, yes, when we do see what is going on, but there are so many as well when we miss what is going on right in front of us. We miss the ways God is moving in the world. We miss the ways in which God is moving in unexpected ways. We need to know our blindness. We need to know our shortcomings so that we know where to lean, so that we know when we need help, when we can serve each other, when we can look to Jesus to open our eyes, to help us to see the ways in which God is already present in our lives, the ways God is moving in this world. Because only when our eyes are opened to our blindness can we truly begin to see. Amen.